That night, the silence inside that house screamed louder than any cry ever could. Every shadow hid a memory. Every creak in the floor whispered secrets no one dared to speak. But tonight, those secrets will finally be revealed. If you believe that some stories deserve to be heard, subscribe now, leave your like, and stay until the end, because what you're about to witness will haunt your heart. It wasn't the kind of the screen fades that to comforts. That was the kind the silence that breathes against your neck and waits for you to move. Every sound, the tick of the old wooden clock, the soft hum of the refrigerator felt too loud, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, the floorboards cold beneath my feet, staring at the door. It was closed, but that never meant safe. I was 15, wearing the same blue nightdress my mother had sewn for me from old curtains, pretending to read while my hands trembled over the pages. The storm outside had stopped hours ago, but the air still smelled like rain and dust. I could hear my grandmother's rosary beads clicking from her room down the hall. That soft rhythm that once comforted me, but now only marked time's second. He'd wait until everyone was asleep, footsteps until the house descended to the darkness. And when he opened the door, it was never sudden. It was quiet, careful, like a secret no one wanted to keep, but no one dared to expose. That night was different. The moment I heard the handle turn, I felt something inside me snap, not fear, not anger, but something deeper, quieter. The kind of breaking just makes no sound, just one night of peace. I closed my eyes open anyway, and prayed for him and to walk past the smell of his cigarettes filled the air before I even saw his shadow stretch across the floor. He whispered my name soft, almost tender. "You're still awake." His voice slithered through the dark like smoke. I didn't answer. I wanted to disappear into the silence, to become invisible. His hand brushed against my shoulder. "You know I love you, and I felt my whole body stiffen. I remember how those words twisted in my stomach. How the word love became something filthy. That night, I learned early that in our house, silence was survival. My mother's silence, my grandmother's silence, mine. When I told her once, when I gathered all the courage I had and said, 'He comes into my room,' she just looked at me with that tired, haunted face and said, 'You must have dreamed it.' Queried the stove that then evening, she walked away as if nothing had happened, her hands shaking slightly, her eyes fixed on the pot. She knew, God, she knew, but she was too broken to fight him, and I was too young to fight alone. For years, that house became a prison wrapped in routine. I went to school, came home, helped my grandmother hang laundry on the line, smiled when the neighbors waved. Everyone thought we were even one father of the year kind at the local church-going kind. I stood beside him on stage, my hands folded neatly, smiling for the photo, while my stomach churned with shame. It went on like that for 3 more years. Every night the same fear, the same silence, until the day he asked me for something impossible. It was the summer of 1978. The heat was suffocating, the kind that glued your dress to your skin, her cough and made the air fill the house like a warning. One evening, he came home drunk, his shirt unbuttoned, his face red from the sun and alcohol. He called me into the kitchen and placed a small velvet box on the table. Inside was a ring silver with a tiny sapphire. "For you," he said. "You're a woman now." His words made my stomach twist. I wanted to Then throw he the said ring the words into the that sink, changed to everything. scream, "When to your run." mother's But gone, I just stared he at whispered, it, frozen.
"You'll
take care of me, like she did. You understand?" I remember that moment like lightning. The world went silent, then deafening all at once. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ear. My throat tightened. I said nothing, but inside, something shifted. The silence that once protected me turned into something else fuel. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, feeling the old cracks in the plaster like constellations above me. I thought about all the years I'd lost, the girl I'd been before the fear. I thought about my mother's tired eyes, about the way she'd look away every time he touched me in front of her. And I decided something simple, something final. I would not let him win again. The next morning, I packed a small bag, some clothes, a picture of my mother when she was young, and the few coins I'd saved from helping at the bakery down the street. I waited until dawn, when even the birds were still asleep, and I walked out the front door barefoot. The street was empty, the sky pale blue. For the first time I could hear my own footsteps and nothing else. No whisper, no
It didn't
threat,
smell like
just
rain
air.
or
I
taste
didn't
like
look victory. Freedom
It was
wasn't
cold,
what I
lonely,
imagined, and heavier than the silence I'd escaped. The morning I left, I walked until the soles of my feet burned. The road curved out of town, past the sugarcane field that glowed gold in the rising sun. I kept my eyes on the horizon, afraid that if I looked back, the house would pull me in again, like a nightmare that refuses to end.
Dona
I
Beaches
found work in
was
a small
widow
bakery
with kind
to
eyes
towns
and
over,
a voice that
in
never
Santa
rose
Amelia.
above a
whisper. She didn't ask questions when I said my parents were gone, and I didn't offer detail. I slept in a tiny room behind the ovens, the smell of yeast and sugar sticking to my hair even after washing. I was 17, earning 3 cruzeros a day, saving every coin in a tin box
At
under
night,
my pillow. I'd hear
it
the
wasn't
city hum
much,
outside
but
my
it
window.
was
My nerd with
a
clean
mix
hands,
of
dogs barking, radios playing love songs, and the distant sound of trains. Sometimes I'd sit by the window and watch the stars, wondering if my mother was still alive. I wanted to hate her for her silence, but grief and anger often wear the same face, and I couldn't tell which one I was looking at anymore. Months turned into years. I learned to knead dough, to carry trays without burning my arms, to smile at customers even when my heart was elsewhere. Beatrice treated me like a daughter. She'd say, "The world will never hand you peace, Menina. You have to bake it yourself." She was the first person who taught me what kindness felt like without a price. But peace, even baked fresh each morning, never lasts long. One afternoon, broad shoulders, as I was sweeping the front with graves. For a moment, I saw a familiar figure across the street. I dropped the broom and stumbled back into the bakery. It couldn't be him. It had been almost 5 years. My hands shook so violently that I spilled flour across the counter. Beatrice came running, asking if I was ill, but I couldn't speak. I pressed my back against the wall and waited, counting my breaths. When I finally looked outside again, sometimes the where human faces, maybe just it was a trick of they memory. Still own a piece of us. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, my fingers tracing the edge of the ring. I still carried in my bag the silver one he had given me. I kept it not as a memory, but as proof of what I'd survived. I told myself I'd throw it away someday, but I never did. Perhaps part of me still feared that if I let it go, I had no saved one enough would believe to rent my small had ever been one real. Room, a tiny kitchen, a shared bathroom at the end of the hall. The landlord, Senor Arlindo, was a retired policeman who spent his days drinking bitter coffee and listening to soccer on the radio. He called me the quiet girl and left me alone, which was all I wanted. I bought second-hand furniture, a few for the first time, and a yellow curtain. I felt like I was building a life not made of fear, but of small, fragile hopes. Then, one evening, I received a letter. It had no return address, only my name, written in my mother's handwriting. My hands went cold before I even opened it. Inside were 4 lines. He's sick. He asks for you. Please come before it's too late. The paper smelled faintly of the soap she used to wash our clothes. Reading it over and over, the words blurring as tears burned my eyes. My mother was alive. He was dying. And now she was asking me to go back to the place I had sworn never to see again. I told Beatrice the next morning. She held my hand and said softly, "Sometimes forgiveness isn't about them. It's about letting go of what still holds you." But she didn't know what he had done. Forgiveness wasn't what he had taken how to pronounce without choke. Still, the guilt grew heavier with each passing day. I imagined my mother coughing, alone, waiting. I imagined his face pale, weak, maybe begging for mercy. I hated that part of me wanted to see him powerless, small, afraid. 2 weeks later, I bought a train ticket back to my hometown. The journey took as the fields blurred past the window, it felt like crossing I kept my hand over the ring in my pocket, gripping it until it left a mark on my palm. I promised myself I wouldn't cry. I wouldn't forgive. I would just look him in the eye and tell him that I survived, that I had built a life beyond his shadow. When I arrived, the town looked smaller, almost unreal. The bakery was gone, replaced by a pharmacy. The church bells still rang the familiar dirt road, and the same stray dogs slept my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The windows were cracked, the paint peeling, and when I stepped through the gate, I heard it again, the silence. That same thick, suffocating silence from years ago, waiting to greet me like an old enemy. My mother opened the door. Her hair was gray, her body frail, but her eyes were the same tired, scared,
Sorry.
I wanted
She
to
whispered,
ask her why now.
He's in the
Why
back room.
after all
He
these
doesn't
years?
have much
Why
time.
should I look at the man who stole everything from me? But instead, I just nodded. I walked down the hall, each step echoing against the wooden floor. The same floor that once creaked under his footsteps. I stopped outside his room, the air thick with the smell of medicine and sweat. My hand hovered over the doorknob. After all those years, I thought I felt was the weight of everything unsaid. I opened the door. Vindication. He looked smaller than I remembered. The man who once filled every corner of that house with fear now seemed to shrink into the bed, swallowed by yellowed sheets and the smell of sick. His chest rose and fell in shallow jerks, a faint rattle echoing in his throat. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. The years had carved deep lines across
when
his
his
eyes
face
opened, his
and
hands
met mine,
trembling like brittle
the world
twigs.
around
Me froze. That look, that same cold, knowing look I'd seen in the dark all those years ago. Even with death clinging to him, it was still their control, power, that twisted sense of ownership. My stomach turned. I wanted to step back, to run again, but his voice came out, a rasp barely louder than a whisper.
You came,
my fingers
he said.
dug into
I
the
knew
fabric
you would.
of my
I
dress.
didn't answer,
Trying to
couldn't.
anchor myself in something real, something solid. He coughed, a wet, painful sound, and gestured weakly toward the chair by his bed or sit. Please. I remained standing. Say what you need to say, I told him. My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. It was steady, quiet, almost calm. He smiled faintly, and for a second,
the mention
of her name
hit like a slap.
How human he looked.
I said,
You still have that fire
speak about her.
He murmured.
He nodded,
Just like your
coughing
mother. Again. A drop of blood staining the pillow. She never stopped loving you, you know. She wanted to protect you. I laughed sharp, bitter. Protect me? She let it happen. Every night. She saw the bruises. She heard me cry. His eyes flickered with something regret. Guilt? She was afraid of me.
He
the
said,
last cruel
just
act
like you
of a
were.
man, but she
who
wasn't
knew how
strong
to twist
enough
the
to
truth.
leave, and you were strong enough to break us both. Silence settled again, thick and suffocating. The old clock ticked on the nightstand, the same one that used to measure the hours of my fear. I wanted to scream, to throw it against the wall, to shatter everything that still tied me to this place. Then he said it, the thing that made my knees weaken. Unsure if I had heard right. What? He coughed again, his voice barely a breath. I need peace before I go. The priest won't come. Your mother tried, but he said my sins were too heavy. Only you can give me peace now. Only you can forgive me. For a second, the room tilted. I felt the blood drain from my face. Forgiveness from me after everything? I
you
took
even
a step
know
closer.
what you're asking?
My voice low.
He
nodded slowly, his eyes closing. Yes, I know. Something inside me snapped. Years of silence, of nights spent shaking under the weight of his shadow, came pouring out. You ruined me, I said. You made me afraid of love, of touch, of myself. You took everything that was pure and made it dirty. You made me believe I was broken, And
my
you
voice
think a
trembled
few
now,
dying words
raw
will
and
fix
trembling
that.
like an
His
open
breath
wound.
rattled. No, he whispered. Nothing can fix it. But maybe you can let go. I wanted to hate him more for saying that, for trying to make his death about my healing. I turned away, my hands shaking. The walls felt like they were closing in the same faded wallpaper, the same smell of damp wood. Every corner of that room was haunted by the ghost of the girl I used to be. She stood in the doorway. Then my mother's voice
her
came
eyes
from
swollen
behind
from
me,
crying.
He's dying. Don't carry this with you forever. I turned to her, and something inside me cracked open. I carried it because you didn't. Her face broke, and she fell to her knees beside the bed. I know I failed you. But I thought if I stayed quiet, if I kept the family together, one day he'd stop. I was wrong. I wanted to hate her too, but all I saw was a woman hollowed out by fear, by choices she never had the courage to make. I looked at him again. His eyes were fading now, clouded and distant. The man who had once been the monster of my nights was just a frail body gasping for air. Forgive him? No. But release him, maybe. I took the ring from my pocket, the silver one with the sapphire, the symbol of everything stolen from me anymore. I placed it on his chest. But the words came out as a broken belongs to you. Then, just like that, he was gone. The clock ticked once more, then stopped. For a long time, no one moved. My mother sobbed softly. I stood still, feeling the strange quiet settle over the room. It wasn't the same suffocating silence as before. This one felt empty, like something had finally been buried. The night air was cool against my house for the first time without since I was a child. The silence didn't scare me. It was just silence, nothing more. I didn't attend the funeral. My mother called the next morning, her voice trembling through the crackling line. He's gone, she said. The priest finally agreed to bless him. I said nothing. I let her words hang in the air until they dissolved into static. Then I hung up. For the 3 days. Steps, I wandered behind the school like a ghost haunting its own touching memories like wounds that refused to close. Everywhere I went, people whispered. They remembered me as the quiet girl who vanished, the one who left her poor mother alone. No one ever knew what happened behind that house's blue door. They never asked. That night, I returned to the house one last time, not for him. My mother sat at the kitchen table. The air was heavy, her hands clasped together, and grief, like she was still praying. The walls felt smaller, the colors drained. It was the same house, but it no longer had the power to swallow me whole. I didn't think you'd come back, she said quietly when I entered. I almost didn't. She looked up, her eyes rimmed with red. You were right to hate me. I sat across from her. The wooden chair creaked beneath my weight, the same sound it made when I was a child, sitting there with scraped knees and silent tears. I don't hate you, I said finally, but I don't know how to love you either. Tears spilled down her face, and she whispered, I never wanted this life for you. I thought silence would keep us safe. Silence kept him safe, I said. The clock on the wall ticked once, then stopped
Maybe
again. It was broken. Or maybe it was tired of marking time in this cursed house. That night, I slept in my old room. The same faded wallpaper, the same window overlooking the fig tree in the yard. I ran my hand along the wall, feeling the groove of the paint where I'd once carved tiny scratches for every night I survived. I counted them again. 83. Then I stopped. I didn't
My
need
mother
to remember
was asleep
anymore.
at the table.
I left before
A rosary
sunrise clutched between her fingers. I kissed the top of her head, whispered goodbye, and walked into the morning mist. Back in Santa Amelia, life moved on. The bakery smelled of bread and laughter again. Beatrice hugged me tight and said, "You look lighter." Maybe she was right. I felt something loosen in my chest, but it wasn't peace. It was space. I tried
Space
once,
where fear
when I
used
was
to
30,
live.
months
With a man
turned
named
into
Paulo
years.
Akai.
I never
Patient
met soul who smelled like coffee and rain. But every time he touched me, something in me recoiled. Not because of him, but because touch had once been a language of harm. I ended it gently, telling him I needed to learn how to love without trembling. He kissed my forehead and said, "Then start with yourself." I took his advice. By
I called it
1995 because every
I had
loaf
saved
of bread
enough
to open
every
my own
sunrise
bakery, a
felt
like a small
bright
rebirth.
place on
I
Rua
hired
das
2 young
Flores.
girls from the orphanage, taught them how to knead dough, how to smile with tired eyes. I never told them my story, but sometimes, when one of them flinched at if you've made it this far, you already feel it, that chill, that weight, that silence that still speaks even after all
Hit
these
the like
years.
button.
Don't let this
Subscribe
story vanish
and turn
into
on
the
the
dark.
bell.
Because there are truths like this one that must never be buried again. Each new story uncovers another piece of the pain and the strength that survives it. Loud voice or avoided eye contact. I recognized the shadow in them. I made sure they knew they were safe there. Then, one day, a letter arrived again. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. It was of my mother,
said
Rio
Younger,
de Janeiro.
standing
Inside
in front
was a
of the
single
old
sheet
house.
of paper.
Beside
Beside her
old
was a
photograph.
man I didn't recognize. He wasn't my stepfather. His arm was around her waist, his face turned slightly toward the camera. And on the back of the photo, in faint blue ink, were the words, "Your real father loved you more than his own life. Forgive me for hiding the truth." The world seemed to tilt. I stared at the photograph. My real father, until my vision
all those
blurred.
years.
I thought my stepfather had been the only man in her life. But now, everything I'd believed about my childhood fractured. I turned the photo over again. The man's smile was warm, gentle. There was something familiar about his eyes, the shape, the light. I ran my fingers over his face, tracing the outline. And for the first time in decades, I felt tears fall not from
Her
pain,
voice
on the phone,
but from the
was
ache
weaker
of
never
now,
having known
barely
him.
above
I
a
needed
whisper.
answers.
I knew this
I
day would
called my
come,
mother. She said, "He was a good man, your real father. We were young. He wanted to take you away, but your stepfather found out. He threatened him. He made him disappear." The words hit me like a wave. My stepfather hadn't just destroyed me, he'd stolen my past. My mother sobbed softly, through the receiver.
When I
thought
hung
I was
up,
protecting
the world
you by
outside
keeping the
felt
truth
different.
buried. The
But
air,
lies rot in
the
silence.
sky,
They
the sound
always
of the
do.
city, it all shimmered with something fragile and new. My life hadn't begun the night I escaped that house. It had begun the day I decided to face it. But now I saw the truth. Freedom wasn't about running away. It was about reclaiming what was taken, name by name, truth by truth. That night, I placed the photograph on my bedside table
smile beside a
and
candle.
whispered, I hope you know I made it. I hope you'd be proud. The flame flickered, casting light across the room, and for the first time in my life, the silence didn't sound like fear or empty. It sounded like peace. When my mother died in the spring of 2001, the world didn't stop. The city kept breathing, traffic humming, lives unfolding. I thanked her,
But inside me,
hung up, something
and
went sat
still.
on the edge
call
of my
came
bed
early in the
staring
morning.
at the
She
wall
passed
for what
peacefully.
felt like hours.
The nurse said,
Peacefully. The word echoed in my head, sharp and foreign. Peace was something she had chased her whole life, but never truly found. I wasn't sure she even believed she deserved it. The funeral was small, just me, a few neighbors, and a priest with kind eyes who spoke like he understood the weight
I
of
stood
silence.
beside
her coffin, the scent of lilies thick in the air, and thought about all the years between us, the distance we built out of fear, the words we never said. After everyone left, I stayed. I placed my hand on the coffin and whispered, I forgive you. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't lift the grief off my chest or erase the past, but it opened something, a quiet corner in my heart. A week
where
later,
anger had lived
I
too
went
long.
back to her house one last time to sort through her thing. The house hadn't changed much. The rosary still hung by the door. The same clock sat on the wall, still frozen at the same minute it had stopped ticking all those years ago. Dust had settled like a soft memory over everything. I started with her drawers, old letters, photographs, church receipts. Then, in the bottom of her wardrobe,
My mother's handwriting
I found a wooden
was
box
carved
wrapped
faintly
in a piece
on the
of
lace.
Para minha filha, quando o tempo me calar. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were three things: a small silver cross, a folded piece of paper, and a birth certificate. The paper was a letter. My dear Maria, it began, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the truth can no longer hurt us the way
The
it
man
once
who
did.
raised you,
I have carried
the one
a
you
burden
feared
for most
was
of
not
my life.
only my husband,
Not out
he
of
was your
cruelty,
uncle,
but
my
out
late
of
husband's
terror.
brother.
I stopped breathing. My uncle. The word burned. My skin went cold. My knees weakened. He forced me into that marriage after your father disappeared. He said he would ruin our family, expose my past. I believed I was saving you from worse. I know now that I failed you, that I gave
pressed
you
the
to the
paper
very
against my
monster who
chest,
destroyed
the air
everything
thick
I
and
loved.
heavy.
The truth was worse than I had imagined, but it was also freeing. It explained everything, the fear in her eyes, the way she never looked at him the same way, the way she prayed, as if each word was a battle. Please forgive me, Minha Filha, she wrote. I kept your father's name hidden to protect you, but you deserve to know. His
If
name
you
was
ever
Daniel
find him,
Sampaio.
tell
He
him I
lived
loved him
for a time
until my
in
last
Rio.
breath.
I sat there for a long time, the house breathing around me. Dust danced in the sunlight. Outside, a bird sang, faint, persistent. Daniel Sampaio. My real father had a name. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every memory from my childhood replayed with new meaning. My mother's silence, her trembling hand, the look
next
in
morning,
her eyes.
I packed
Whenever
a
my
small
stepfather
bag
walked
and
took
into
the
the
first
room.
bus to Rio
It
de
all
Janeiro.
made sense
I
now.
didn't tell
She
anyone.
wasn't complicit.
I just knew
She
I
was
had
captive.
to go. The journey took 6 hours. The closer I got to the city, the heavier my heart became. What if he was gone? What if I was chasing a ghost? I found an old address from one of my mother's letters. A small apartment near Lapa. The building was decaying, walls cracked and sun-stained. I climbed the stairs
but there was a
slowly.
name
My
on the
hands
mailbox.
shook as I knocked.
No
S-A-M-P-A. I knocked again. My pulse quickened. Then, finally, the door opened, and a man in his 70s stood before me. His hair was white, his eyes a deep brown that shimmered with confusion and recognition all at once. "Can I help you?" he asked softly. I could barely speak. "My name is Maria Alves." The color
Your mother's
drained from
Maria.
his face. Tears
He gripped
blurred
the
my
doorframe.
vision.
I
As if the
nodded.
world
She
had
told me
tilted
about
beneath
you
him.
too late.
"Maria," he
stepped
whispered,
closer,
his hand trembling as it reached toward me. "You look just like her," he said. Then his voice broke. "I thought you both were gone." We stood there, two strangers bound by blood and decades of silence, crying in the dim hallway of a building that smelled of salt and rain. He invited me in. The apartment was small, filled with books and photographs, and in the corner, an old painting of a woman holding a child. "My mother taught me. I painted that after they took you away," he said, his voice shaking. "I searched for you. I sat beside him, listening as he told me everything. How he and my mother fell in love, how her family disapproved, how his brother returned from the war
As he spoke,
and destroyed
something
inside
everything
me out
mended,
of jealousy,
piece by
and
piece.
greed. Not
How
he
perfectly.
disappeared to
Some
protect
cracks
her would always remain, but enough for light to enter again. When I finally left that day, the sky was burning gold over the city. I looked up, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, and whispered, "The silence ends here." When I came back home from Rio, something in me had shifted. Not all
For
at
years,
once. I'd
but
walked
like a
through
while
life feeling
that
like
had
a ghost
finally
in my
begun
own
to
story.
breathe.
But now I carried names, faces, truths. The silence that once imprisoned me had lost its power. One rented a small apartment near the sea. It wasn't much. 1 bedroom, faded blue walls. A balcony that looked out over the endless gray horizon. But it was mine. For the first time, I could lock the door and know
The
that
music
no
helped
one
me
would walk
heal.
in without knocking.
It filled the
I
empty
started
spaces
teaching piano.
my
Mother's
to children
prayers in the
used to
neighborhood
echo
through. Every morning, I'd wake to the sound of waves crashing and whisper to myself, "You're safe now." Sometimes I believed it. Other times, the old shadows still followed me, in dreams, in sudden silences, in the creak of a floorboard that sounded too familiar. Months passed. I wrote letters to my real father every Sunday. but
He'd
really,
reply with
he'd
shaky
call me
handwriting
Minha Filha
and
da
stories
Esperança,
of the years he
my
lost.
daughter of hope. But healing, I learned, doesn't erase the past. It just teaches you how to live beside it. One night in October, it rained so hard the streets flooded. I was sitting by the window, drinking tea, watching the lightning trace veins across the sky, when I heard it. A knock, dot, three sharp
For a
knocks.
second,
My heart
I was
stopped.
10
again, frozen in that old house, counting the seconds between the sound and the pain that followed. I told myself it was just a neighbor, maybe the woman from Forby asking for help with the power. But something in the rhythm of that knock felt deliberate. I stood up slowly, set my cup down, and walked to the door. "Who is it?" I asked. No answer. Another knock. Slower
When
this
I
time.
opened the
my
door,
fingers
a
trembled
gust of wind
as I
swept
reached
through
for
the
the hallway.
handle.
Cold, smelling of rain and old metal. A man stood there, tall, maybe in his 40s, soaked to the bone. His eyes were dark, searching, too familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. "Can I help you?" I asked. He took a breath, hesitant. "You're Maria Alves." "Yes," he nodded, his jaw tightening. "I've been looking
He
for
was
you.
my father."
My name is
For a
Raphael."
moment,
The
he
world
paused,
went silent.
then said
the
the
thunder
words
that
the
made
rain,
the air leave
even
my
my
heartbeat gone. Only his words remained. "Your father," I whispered. "You mean?" "Yes," he said. "The man you called your stepfather. I'm his son." I stepped back instinctively. My pulse roared in my ears. "Why are you here?" He looked down, his voice breaking. "Because I need to understand." I don't
found
know
his
what's
journals
true
anymore.
after he died. The smell of wet earth filled the room.
about
As I
you,
let him
about
in, he
guilt.
stood by the window, water dripping from his coat, eyes scanning the few photos I had on the wall. My mother, my students, a faded picture of the beach. "I didn't come to hurt you," he said quietly. "I came to apologize for what he did, for what our name became." I studied him in the dim light. His face wasn't his father's, but the shadow of it lingered in the shape of his mouth, the way he avoided my gaze. I felt anger rise, hot and sharp, but beneath it, something softer. Pity, maybe, or the quiet understanding that children often inherit pain they never asked for. "Did you know?" I asked. "When you were young." He shook his head a no. He was strict, cold. I thought
The
he
rain
was just
hammered against the
distant.
glass.
I didn't
He pulled
know
a small,
what that distance
folded
was hiding.
piece of paper
We sat in
from
silence
his pocket
and set it on the table between us. "I think you should have this," he said. It's the last page of his journal. He wrote it the night before he died. I hesitated before touching it. The paper was thin, almost translucent, the ink smudged from time. I read the words slowly, each one cutting deeper than the last. I pray
I
she
see
finds
her face
peace in my
where I
dreams.
could
The
not.
girl I
Tell
broke.
her I
The
was weak,
silence I
not
created,
cruel.
though it makes no difference now. My throat tightened. My hands shook. I wanted to tear it apart, to scream that it was too little, too late, but instead, I just let it fall to the table. Raphael watched me, his expression heavy with regret. "I know sorry isn't enough, but maybe it's a start," I nodded faintly.
He looked down,
You can't
tears
rewrite
welling
what
in
he
his
did,
eyes,
but you
I'm
can choose
trying
to be different.
For the
first time in my life, I believed it. When he left that night, the storm had eased. The rain slowed to a whisper. I stood by the window long after he was gone, the letter still on my table, the sound of the ocean rising in the distance. The past had knocked on my door again, but this time I didn't hide. I closed my eyes.
It started
feeling
as
the weight
something
small, just a
way
little.
to
I
let
whispered
go of
into
what
the
I
quiet.
couldn't keep
You don't
inside
own me
anymore.
I began writing late at night when the sea was calm and the world was quiet enough for old memories to resurface without breaking me apart. I didn't plan for anyone to read it. It was supposed to be mine, a confession whispered onto paper, an act of survival disguised as a memoir. But pain has a way of attracting
the house
light.
of silence,
And once it
out,
took me almost
it spreads
2
like
years
wildfire.
to finish. 2 years of reliving every detail I once swore I'd never revisit. The sound of his footsteps, the smell of his cigarettes, the trembling prayers whispered by my mother in the dark. Every sentence felt like a wound reopened, but also like a thread being pulled free. I printed the pages on cheap paper, tied them with a ribbon.
That's where they
and
stayed
left them on
until
my
one
desk. Of my students, little Anna, just 12, found them. She was helping me tidy the room and asked, "Is this your story, teacher?" I told her yes, and she smiled shyly. "You should show people. Maybe someone needs to hear it." Her innocence disarmed me. For a moment, I thought, maybe she's right. A month later, I sent the manuscript to a small
It broke
publisher
us
in Sao
We'd
Paulo.
be honored to
I
publish
didn't
it.
expect a reply.
I cried for
but
a long
3 weeks
time.
after, not from
A letter
joy,
arrived,
but
"We
from the
read
sheer
your work."
terror of being seen. When the book came out, it didn't make headlines. Not at first. It spread quietly, like an echo, passed from one trembling hand to another. But then, something shifted. A journalist from a local paper wrote an article. The woman who broke Brazil's oldest silence. Radio interviews. My television
wouldn't
requests.
stop ringing.
Strangers sending letters saying they lived the same pain. Women, not men, even priests. People began calling me the grandmother of truth. At first, it felt like redemption, like everything I endured had finally found me. But the attention soon turned cruel. Some said I was lying. Others said I was exaggerating for fame. I read comments
Anonymous
online
messages
calling me
arrived at
delusional.
my door,
bitter.
"Let the dead stay
Disgrace to
buried."
her family. One night, someone scrawled LIR across my gate in red pen. I sat in my kitchen, staring at it through the window, feeling my body tremble with the old, familiar fear. I wanted to disappear again, to lock the doors, to stay silent. But then I remembered my mother's voice, trembling, soft. "Tell him I loved him until
next
my
morning,
last breath." I walked
she
outside
never got
with a
to
bucket
speak her
of
truth.
water, but
And a
I
rag.
did. I scrubbed the word away myself, each stroke a refuge. People watched from across the street. No one helped, but no one stopped me either. By the time I finished, my hands were raw and my knees ached. But the gate was clean. The silence was gone. That same afternoon, I received a letter from a woman in Bahia. She wrote, I
Thank
read
you
your
for
book
giving
in
me
one
permission to
sitting. I'm
speak.
63.
I sat
What
there
you
holding
lived,
her words.
I lived too.
Tears
But
blurring
I
the
never
ink.
told
It hit
anyone
me then.
until now.
My story wasn't mine anymore.
It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced and was waiting for someone else to go first. From that day, I stopped fearing my past. I began traveling, speaking in schools and churches. I told young girls, your silence is never protection.
Some
It's
nights,
just a cage
after
someone else
conferences
built.
and interviews,
But the truth has
I'd
a cost.
come home,
Each retelling
sit on the
drained me a
floor,
little
and
more, ask myself if I'd done the right thing, if reopening these wounds for the world was worth it. Then I'd think of that woman from Bahia and the hundreds of others who followed, and I'd whisper to the walls, yes, it was still something inside me remained unsettled. A question I couldn't silence. Had I really freed myself, or just found a new kind of prison? Because the more people praised me, the less I recognized the woman they were talking about. They saw a survivor, a symbol of strength, but they didn't see the sleepless nights, the trembling hand, the moments I still flinched when someone raised their voice. The truth had saved me, but it had also consumed me. And just when I thought I had nothing left to give, when I was ready to close this chapter forever, a letter arrived in a handwriting I hadn't seen in decades. The return address was smudged, almost unreadable, but the signature at the bottom was clear enough to make my heart stop. With love, Daniel Sampaio. The letter burned in my hands for hours. I stared at it over and over, the ink smudging slightly from my
all
tears.
these years,
Daniel
and
Sampaio,
reaching out
my
only
real
now.
father. I felt a strange cocktail of fear, anger, and longing swirl inside me. Could I face him after all that time? Could I trust the world wasn't just setting another trap, another lie layered over the truths I had fought decades to uncover? I booked a flight to Rio the next morning. The city greeted me with the familiar smell of salt and rain, the streets alive with people. I carried nothing but a small bag of essentials. That always the letter made me folded feel inside my jacket pocket and at like a secret talisman. When I arrived at his address, it was an old apartment complex tucked away on a quiet. The walls were faded and cracked, the paint peeling like old memories. I hesitated outside his door, my hand hovering over the knob. Memories of fear, pain, and silence came crashing back in waves. But then I thought of the thousands of people my story had touched, the voices that had risen. Because I dared to speak, and I told myself I had to do this. I knocked. A frail voice called, Maria. I opened the door, and there he was, his shoulders stooped, his hair silver white, eyes deep pools of sorrow and relief. He looked like a man who had carried decades of guilt on his back, bending
How could
him,
I explain
but never
30
breaking
years of
him
loss,
completely.
fear,
Up
and
I
stolen
began,
time,
then
he
faltered.
stepped closer,
Words were tears
inadequate.
glistening in his eyes. I never stopped searching for you, he said, voice shaking. Every night I dreamed of finding you. I never knew if you were alive or if the world had swallowed you whole. I could only nod. My throat was raw, my hands trembling. The apartment smelled of old books and dust, You
a
have
set that
every right
strangely
to
felt
hate
like
me.
home.
He
He
whispered.
gestured for
I
me
disappeared
to sit.
because I
did,
was afraid,
keeping my distance,
afraid for you,
still wary
for your mother. But I never wanted you to suffer. I remembered the letter from my mother, her confession about the truth she kept hidden, the man who had destroyed everything. You didn't save her, I said softly. You didn't save me. You were gone. Daniel winced as if I had struck him. I know. I failed you both in ways
let me
I
tell
can
you
never
everything.
undo. But
He
I
spoke
am
for
here now,
hours.
filling in gaps that had haunted me since childhood. How he and my mother had been young and in love, planning a life that was stolen before it could begin. How my stepfather had threatened him. How he had disappeared out of desperation to protect us. How he had searched tirelessly, never giving up hope. And then the last piece of the puzzle came. My brother, the revelation my mother's letters
he didn't act
had
alone.
never mentioned. Daniel said quietly, his hands trembling. There were others who knew about his cruelty. They looked away. Some even helped him cover it up. The man who raised you, he was a monster, but he thrived because everyone stayed silent. The words hit me like lightning. The world I thought I understood shattered once again. My childhood pain had been compounded by the complicity
I
of
said
so
finally,
many,
looking him
network
in
of
the
silence,
eyes.
not
That
for
had
him,
kept
me trapped
not
for
because
he deserved it, but because I needed to free myself. The act felt heavier than any physical burden I had ever carried, and yet lighter than the weight of years spent alone with my memories. He nodded, tears slipping freely down his cheeks. Thank you, he whispered. I never stopped hoping you would. We sat together
For the first
in
time
silence
in
for a
decades.
long time. I felt the apartment
settle,
quiet,
not
like
chains
for
around
the
my
hum of
wrist,
the city,
but
like
outside.
dust falling from a high shelf. Pieces of the life I had feared I would never reclaim began to align. When I left that evening, the sky was streaked with gold and violet. I carried nothing but the knowledge that I had found him, that I had heard the final truth, that I could finally live without the shadow of questions
And
dangling
as I
over
walked
me through the streets of Rio, I realized something profound. The silence of my childhood was gone, not erased, not forgotten, but transformed into a voice powerful enough to shape a new life. I returned home from Rio with a weight lifted, yet a fire ignited. The past was no longer an anchor. It had become a compass. The air in my apartment felt different, infused with possibility, as if every
opened my
bakery that
Aurora,
had clung
with
to me
renewed
over the
purpose,
years, but
had
now it
finally
wasn't
released
just
its
about
grip.
bread or quiet mornings by the sea. It was about creating a space where others could find refuge, strength, and voice. I began hosting small gatherings in the back room. Women who had suffered in silence, girls who had learned to fear touch and trust, men whose lives had been stolen by betrayal and neglect. And each time
story was raw,
I listened without
messy,
judgment,
sometimes
holding
terrifying.
space for pain that had once been forbidden. When one of them finally whispered, I survived, I felt it as a triumph that wasn't just theirs, but ours collectively. Yet, even as I helped others, remnants of the past haunted me. Some days, I would see a flash of him in a stranger's eyes, or feel the cold silence settle like a
Healing
shadow
was
across my
uneven,
shoulders.
jagged,
Fear didn't
like a
vanish
jagged
overnight,
coastline
shaped by storm and tide. One evening, long after closing the bakery, I heard a knock at my door. My heart leapt, familiar anxiety clawing at my chest. I opened it to find a man I did not recognize, older, wearing a coat soaked from the rain. He introduced himself as a historian researching old cases of abuse and family crimes
He
in
said
our town.
he
had found
cases
evidence of
that my
story
stepfather's
had touched
accomplices,
indirectly. Others who had thrived in the shadows and never faced accountability. He handed me a folder, and inside were letters, old photographs, legal documents, proof that the network of silence I had lived through had been broader than I realized. I could feel my stomach knot, a mix of fear, rage, and inevitability. Why show me this? And because you can tell it better
the world
than
needs
anyone
to know.
But
You
have to
replied
be
softly.
ready. This will reopen wound. I stared at the folder, then at the night sky through my doorway. Rain streaked down the panes, lightning illuminating the edges of my small apartment. In that light, I saw the girl I had been, frozen in fear and silence, and beside her, the woman I had become, strong enough to stand, enough to
sat
speak, beside it for enough
hours,
to turn the pain
letting
into
the tears
purpose.
fall freely.
I took
By
the
the
folder
time dawn came,
and set it on
I
my
had
kitchen
decided
table. I would write again, not only my story, but the stories of those who had suffered and survived because of silence. Not as revenge, but as truth, as legacy. Months passed. The new book, Voices of the Silenced, was published quietly at first, then gathered attention for its
People
raw
wrote to
honesty
me
from
it
across the
became a
country.
movement,
Sometimes
lifeline.
weeping, sometimes angry, sometimes relieved to know they were not alone. And through it all, I realized the greatest power I had gained was not revenge or recognition, but the ability to turn my trauma into a sanctuary for others. Yet, even as I thrived in this new purpose, life had one final confrontation in store. One afternoon, a young
her
woman
hands was a
appeared at the
crumpled
bakery
photograph,
of
19,
a child she
fragile,
claimed had
eyes
been
wide with
abandoned
both
in the
fear
same town
and hope.
decades ago. A child whose story mirrored mine in chilling detail. Her name was Juliana. Her father, the same man who had tormented me. Her presence brought a storm of old emotion rushing back, terror, fury, grief, and yet beneath it, I recognized the rare chance I had been given to be the guide I had
took her
longed
hand,
for in my own.
and
for the first time in years, I didn't flinch. Let me tell you something, I said softly, voice steadied despite the quake in my chest. Your past is not your prison, and the silence they gave you, you don't have to keep it. Not anymore. As Juliana listened, her tears falling freely, I understood the final truth. Survival is not merely end. It is rising. It is using the legacy
what
of
was
pain
stolen from you
transforms to
only
light the way
when
for
someone
someone
dares
else
to
speak, to act, and to heal. In that moment, I realized that my story, every broken memory, every stolen year, had always had a purpose beyond my suffering. And with one last glance at Juliana, I knew it was no longer mine alone.